So Rick Scott and Florida's system for disenfranchising people that they feel they don't want to have the right to vote. Yeah, so John Oliver actually did a piece on this, and there's a lot of information that I confirmed before I started talking to other people about it. So if you are convicted of a crime that is of a certain level, then you can lose your right to vote in Florida. And that's losing your right to vote in federal elections as well as state elections, as well as local elections. And if you try to vote when you're disenfranchised, which it's not always made clear when you get out of prison that you're not allowed to vote, then you can be thrown back in prison for voter fraud. Whether or not you were aware that you weren't allowed to vote, if you try to vote when you're not allowed to vote, then yeah, thrown in jail. Also, it's up to the governor himself to determine whether or not you get the right to vote back. And there's no requirements for that. There's no guidelines. It is solely 100% up to the personal opinion of the governor to determine whether or not you get the right to vote back. So the governor could ask you, are you going to vote for my political party in the future? And if you say no, they can say, okay, well, you don't get the right to vote anymore. You still won't get the right to vote. If you say, hey, I am of your religion, I will vote for your political party, they might be significantly more inclined to return your right to vote. And that's exactly what happened. But with Rick Scott's case, he would basically determine, oh, well, if you're a Christian, then you're obviously fully repentant about whatever the bad thing was that you did before. So the amount of people that claimed Christianity as a factor in why they should be given the right to vote back was like 92%. So if you weren't a Christian when you got out of prison, then you weren't given the right to vote. But Christians were given the right to vote in Florida. Also, if you were Black, good luck. You couldn't just be Black and a Christian and get your right to vote back. That was basically the remaining 8%. Because if you were Black and you were Christian, then you also had to be like significantly into volunteer work. You had to be a big player in the church that you ended up choosing. And if you weren't, then again, you weren't given the right to vote back. Also, quick disclaimer, the Black people in Florida that were convicted of much higher crime levels than white people, particularly when it came to the possession of weed, is insane. You could find, just throwing out random numbers, but this is generally what they found. What John Oliver's team found when they were looking through data is that you could have 10 white people that have a small bag of weed on them and 10 Black people that have a small bag of weed on them. Those 10 Black people were probably thrown into prison for at least a year, if not up to 10 years. That group of white people, they probably got thrown in jail for like a week and then were let out. And the Black people lost the right to vote. The white people didn't lose the right to vote. It was a very easy system for them to say, we're going to take away the right to vote for anybody that we want, and we're going to find something to convict them of to make sure that they can't vote against us. The whole system in Florida is corrupt. It's horrible, like horrible, horrible. And it still exists to this day. Like when Rick Scott stepped down as governor and Ron DeSantis took over, now it's just Ron DeSantis doing the same thing that Rick Scott did. So it's garbage. It's anti-democratic. It is a system to disenfranchise people of a different color. It's garbage. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think speaking to that for the same crime being charged differently. I know I always heard that for a long time. Like I was like a white kid who was caught with weed. It was seen as like, oh, he made a bad decision. We should feel sorry for this guy. Don't throw the book at him.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a white kid caught with possession, it's like, yo, this guy's gonna grow up to be a menace to society. It's best to nip this in the bud now, send him to juvie, put it on his permanent record.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's like a story I've heard like throughout the 90s until now. It's nothing, unfortunately, yeah, there's so many things where people try to talk about it, various personalities, some which we don't really like to promote. Always like to talk
Mm-hmm.
about these topics. They blame the music, they blame the culture, and but then some of them come around to say, maybe it is somewhat systemic, maybe it is intentional. It's not happenstance that this happens. It's very politically driven, it's very agenda driven.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's unfortunate. It's something that persists and people get split on it, right? Because I think growing up, I would always think this is still a topic, this is still an issue, we're still talking about this, but then you realize how much people benefit. So to rehash the same old story and just provide new examples to keep further the narrative. At some point you think, bro, this has been 30, I've been around for almost like what, 30, close to 40 years now, and I keep hearing the same stuff my whole life. That's odd.
Mm-hmm.
It's odd to say that a problem just cannot be fixed. Like, no, we fix problems every single day.
I was going to say that's the thing. Is it that the problem can't be fixed, or is it that there's no incentive to fix the problem.
Exactly. And that's worse.
Yeah.
It's like when people complain about mechanics, right? Oh, don't take your car to the car shop. You take it for one thing, they're gonna find like five other things that need to be fixed. Magically, your car needs to need all these repairs. And I always laugh when I hear situations where it's like, oh, they fixed it, but then somehow they left a tool or something loose. And that came undone. Now you gotta come back in because someone didn't check everything before.
Yeah, I was gonna say it reminds me of when my car was having an oil problem. Actually, I took in the car for an oil change, and $1,300 later, finally got a car that worked again. Apparently, there was a small oil leak when they did the oil change. It made it even worse. Car ended up out of oil like 300 miles from home, and then had to have the seal fixed, and then filled up the car with oil, and then the seal blew again, and then they fixed it again, but now two or three different places, and then filled it up with oil again, and then the seal blew again, and then they were like, oh, there's an inherent problem in the way that everything around it is built that apparently is a thing with Volkswagens, and we need to completely fix this whole system, the air oil intake valve. And I was like, okay, cool. And since it was always an extra thing that needed to be repaired, and it wasn't because the shop didn't do it right in the first place, it was always an added expense. And I was like, so you're saying if you guys just actually assess the situation, figure out what was going on behind the scenes, not just the symptoms of what was going on behind the scene, then it would have cost me a lot less money. This could have gotten dealt with a lot sooner, and my life wouldn't have been interrupted over and over and over again with a car that can't drive. And that's
Yeah,
exactly what's happening with our political system. There's
exactly.
all these issues that the political system is saying, oh, let's just fix the seal. The seal's going to blow again. But we don't care about that because the people that are voting us in are seeing that we tried to fix the seal. And then we still get that seal to blow again and all that money to pour out of that seal right into our pockets. So not fixing the underlying issues translates to the government having more control, government having more power to disenfranchise voters, government having more power to, I don't know, buy and sell stocks while they're in office, while they're making legislation decisions on the things that they're buying and selling stocks for. It's so obviously corrupt. It's so obviously corrupt.
It's a mess, dude. And I understand why people get a bit weary when you talk about solution. So much of it, like you said, may have been inherent. If you just address this one specific thing correctly, it wouldn't have seeped into all these other areas. And now the entire system's messed up
Mm-hmm.
based on this thing that they didn't properly diagnose and assess it the correct way, or acknowledge that they made a mistake early on and then try to come up with a better solution. Instead, they let things ride out because so much money gets poured into any decision that's passed. When I think about wealthy individuals, they're always talking about diversifying their portfolio, right? So that means a
Mm-hmm.
person who's wealthy in one area has their hands in a bunch of different areas, different industries. I think that's why things get messy because you start messing with one area and all of a sudden people who you didn't even know were connected to it start getting involved and start
Mm-hmm.
moving and pushing things in different directions. But that's why it gets very dicey to talk about this stuff and move forward. Okay, let's lay it out. Let's talk about the history. Let's talk about why things are the way they are. And then let's get to talking about solutions and ways of fixing it. Because in many ways, it is kind of revamping and reworking an entire system. But where it gets problematic, and which is why we had to watch how we talk about it, and which why I understand why people get weary, is because when you talk about like, well, the entire thing is messed up, we got to rebuild, and then people then want to go radical with it, and they don't understand what rebuild means. When we say rebuild, is take what's there and comb through and fix different areas and rework entire systems need be. But we do it through voting, we do it through legislation, we do it through transparency, we do it through people actually understanding how this stuff works and through a consensus, how we go about fixing things, right?
Well, and that's why the three percenters and so many different, arguably extremist groups that basically have the stance that everything is corrupt, everything is broken, we need to start from scratch. The problem is their entire purpose is to start from scratch. They don't actually have a system that they can point to that says this works really well. Let's do this instead. They just have a what's currently happening is garbage, so we need to throw it out.
Right.
And we saw how that worked. I mean, look at, I don't know, the president for the past 20 years. I mean, you had George W. Bush, who did some good things, did some bad things. A lot of people considered him a garbage president, and a lot of people did. But a lot of people did. And so he got voted out. The Republican Party got voted out effectively. And then Obama took over. And then Obama made things worse. And then people weren't happy with Obama, so he got voted out. And then Trump came in, and then he made things worse. And everybody's like, we can't have Trump. We can't have Trump. So Biden got voted in, and then he made things worse. And now they're like, well, we can't have Biden. So then the question is, what do you do now? Your options are Biden or Trump, and you already know both of them are going to make it worse. So what do you do? This is a very unique situation in American history where you have two presidents that you know both of them are garbage. It's not just, I think they could be garbage. You know they're garbage. You've seen them handle massive, problematic situations in the country, and both of them have failed miserably. And that is even beyond the status quo of the country that they can't even maintain. They're making it worse and worse and worse in the status quo, on top of not being able to handle big issues. And neither of them have any sense of morality. Neither of them have any sense of the way to actually improve the country. Well, Biden at least seems to have an interest in improving the country, whereas Trump only has an interest in pushing his weight around. But also, Biden is so ineffective at doing much of anything
Yeah.
that it's almost like, well, does it even matter if the Democratic Party is basically calling the shots at this point? Because the Democratic Party does just have an interest in serving their own personal needs. And there still are concerns with the Biden family about some of the money that they've made, particularly when it comes to overseas nations that might not have American interests at heart, the Chinese government, for instance. So, I mean, it really is like two absolutely horrible choices. And the only benefit, in my opinion, to choosing Biden over Trump is that it's not going to go downhill quite as fast. And there's at least a buffer between self-interest and president, because it's the president's family or it's the president's political party that is gaining their self-interest benefits. Whereas with Trump, it's himself plus his family plus his political party. And he's much less concerned about just publicly destroying the country to get his way. Biden at least tries to do it in an underhanded way, which I think is slightly better because it makes it less obvious, which creates less social strife.
I mean, the one thing I'll say with Trump, I mean, I don't really like talking about him that much because he's annoying, but
Yeah.
one thing I will say about him that's just so funny. I mean, we have to because the election is a big deal and there's different
Mm-hmm.
factors that we'll touch on. The one thing that
Mm-hmm.
makes me laugh about him so much is this guy's just in a race to get in before he gets indicted and finally charged with something. It's like he just wants to get in just so that he doesn't do jail time.
Yeah, there's a problem with that, which is there's nothing that says you can't arrest the president. Like there's nothing that says you can't do jail time while you're the president. You can run the country from prison. There's nothing that says that can't happen.
That would be amazing. That would be the greatest little Americans ever had.
I mean, it's the epitome of what the American government is right now. You're such a horrible human being that you're behind bars for the remainder of your life. Go ahead and run the country because that's the best option we have, apparently, because the system is so broken.
Dude, have you watched The Gentleman yet on Netflix?
No, not yet. Wait, the one with Matthew McConaughey?
Oh, so they made a show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's like an alternate version or like a spin-off
Hmm.
idea of it. I'm not sure if they're ever going to tie it to the movie, but
Okay.
yeah, it's similar vibes, similar concept. But it's funny because it involves this guy running his criminal empire from prison.
Hmm.
His daughter's pretty much running it, but he still calls the shot from prison. And when they go visit him in prison, dude, it's like he's in his backyard. He's got his own personal chef. He's having these lavish, amazing meals. He has this huge property that he just gets to walk around and just do whatever he wants with, play golf, whatever.
Hmm.
And it's like, is this guy really in jail? It's like a glorified house arrest, right?
Hmm.
And I feel like that would be almost the image you would see of Trump. Basically, it'll be like he's at Mar-a-Lago and just can't leave.
The weird thing would be that he would have Secret Service in there protecting him while
Mhm.
he's in prison.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because that's the one thing is by becoming president, you have Secret Service protection for the remainder of your life. So he would have Secret Service in prison with him for the rest of his life if he went to prison. And that's regardless of whether or not anything that happens, he will still have that protection.
Dude, I almost feel like this should happen just so that America gets ridiculed and hated on by the whole world. And then we're so embarrassed by this, we never allow this again. And actually put in legislation. Because that's the thing that annoys me the most with Trump's presidency post-mortem is the fact that no laws passed after he acted the way he did in office. This is how you know this guy lives and breathes his lawyers because it's almost like his lawyers comb through everything and like, what can I get away with? Oh, all this? Okay. Because everyone keeps making it like a light topic about him not showing his tax returns. It was just common practice that everyone just did it as a show of good faith.
Hmm.
It's not that we want to know his finances, not that we want I know some people do.
Oh, I did. So I will say that's something that I looked into in depth because I was curious. Everybody who seems to support Trump says he's a millionaire. Everybody who doesn't support Trump says he's basically bankrupt
Right.
and that he's just stealing from one group to give to another. And so I was like, well, what's the reality of the situation? Because even though the president is not required to disclose their tax information, they are required to disclose their finances. And I was able to find those online for both presidencies. So I was able to find how much he had coming in from all the different resources. And it's something like 200-page long Excel spreadsheet. And I went through all of it to figure out exactly how much money he was bringing in, how that changed over time, and what his expenses were like. Within his businesses and within his assets, it's not his personal expenses. If he pays to go on a flight or something like that, even if it's his own private jet, I don't know down to that nitty gritty. It's just round numbers because I mean they don't have to disclose everything. Sometimes it is a range that they give, like it's less than $5,000 or between 50 and $70,000, that kind of ranges. And so I was able to figure out, generally speaking, how much money he brought in, and it comes down to the money that his assets bring him equates to the entire yearly presidential salary in about 4.5 hours. In
Mm,
about 4.5 hours, he makes about $400,000. But that doesn't account for all of his expenses and the interest on those expenses. So all of his loans and everything else, which, as we're learning through some mass media, that there's even more expenses that he didn't disclose. It's a very fine line he's walking right now, considering that his businesses could bring in less money. And if they do bring in pretty much any less money, he's going bankrupt and or losing businesses. But if they bring in more money, like say he's the president and he can offer membership to Mar-a-Lago, let everybody know he's going to be at Mar-a-Lago at this time, and then charge extra money for people that are using the golf course during the time that he's there,
mm.
basically giving people access to the president by paying him money to access him, which is illegal. But because there's so many layers of like, well, maybe they just wanted to go on that day. There's plausible deniability for everything he does that's illegal, but he does it so often. Obviously, it's not plausible deniability for anybody that's paying attention.
Right.
But yeah, the membership rates for Mar-a-Lago skyrocketed as soon as he became president, and it was obvious that he was going to continue going to Mar-a-Lago during the time that he was in office. And Mar-a-Lago membership costs are still skyrocketed because there's always the idea that he's going to come back into office.
Mhm. Yeah, there's always someone big name showing up there.
Oh yeah. Well, in foreign nations too. It's not just major businesses. It's also like major companies and major foreign dignitaries going to his properties that just happen to be there on the same day that he's there to pay him money to then be able to access him and talk to him about whatever it is they want to talk to him about.
I think what always bothers me too is the blatant attempt by the media to make him look like a complete idiot. I'm like, no.
No.
The worst thing you can do is assume that this person's a blundering fool that doesn't know what he's doing.
Hmm.
Who knows what they can get away with? You got to look at everything that he does as very calculated, intentional. I always go back to that one rap. It was chanting, lock her up, right? And then Trump, I forget if he looked at the guy, acknowledged him, or if he just paused and said, oh no, we're not doing that anymore. Someone told me that would be a good thing to use on the campaign trail. So I used it.
Hmm.
Highly effective, but now I'm done with it.
Yeah.
And then you see that guy who was chanting lock her up in the background because he was in frame.
Hmm.
You just see him like it's like his whole world crumbled. Like he was so bummed and disappointed.
It's like, oh, you were directly manipulating me. Cool.
Yeah. And that's the thing with him. He's so blatant with it. The fact that he would just say that just straight up to the whole crowd during the rally, oh, I just used it to use it. I need to say to get what I want. There's no shame, there's no guilt. And that's why even with Ivanka, when she was in the interview, she highlighted her favorite chapter from his book, Are the Deal. It was the chapter on perception. Perception is everything. It's how people view you that matters above all else. Doesn't matter if you are actually worth millions of dollars. If people believe you are, that's what matters. If people perceive you to be honest, perceive you to be credible, that is what matters. The perception of you.
Oh, yeah. And that's the other thing is that the perception of a blundering fool is somebody you don't need to worry about. And look at Boris Johnson. He very intentionally wore poorly fitting clothes. His hair was a disaster. He would act like a bumbling fool, so nobody really took him seriously. But then look at some of the political moves that he made, and he was brilliant in the way that he manipulated the British people.
Mm.
I mean, just look at Brexit. Actually, if you've never seen the movie Brexit, it is genius.
Oh,
It's very similar to The Big Short. Obviously, there's some dramatizing of what happened, but there is a lot of really good information that's in there that kind of points out the way things happen for Brexit, like why the UK is separated from the EU. And they very clearly and very obviously set up the entire marketing campaign, which was done by this guy named Dominic Cummings, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, actually. He was the mastermind behind it all. He was like, what do people want? He went to a bunch of bars and he went to coffee shops and he went to like the poor neighborhoods. He went to the middle class neighborhoods and he's like, what do people want? And he broke it down to its core element. And it was things used to be better. People want control. So you look at the Brexit campaign slogan, take back control. That was their campaign slogan.
mm.
It was, we don't have control. Things were better the way they used to be. So that was their campaign slogan. Let's take back control. And what does that remind you of? Make America great again. Because they took everything they learned from the Brexit campaign and applied it to Trump's campaign. The same people that were part of the Brexit campaign were and are part of Trump's campaign. It is literally a one-to-one direct correlation. It was the precursor to Trump's campaign of we're going to promise everything. We're going to just fudge all the numbers. We're going to make up whatever we feel like making up, and we're just going to run with it. And it's all going to be based around this idea that things used to be better, things are falling apart, and we have no sense of control.
Mm.
So, Make America Great Again was America used to be a place where a lot of people thought it was the greatest thing in the world. When America came into World War II, that's when World War II turned around. That's where all of a sudden the European nations of the world, which America generally views as the upper echelon of control and civilization in the world, not true, but maybe by certain standards, that the greatest section of the world aside from us was falling apart into disarray. And as soon as we stepped in, we made the greatest part of the entire world kind of get its act together. And we brought peace, and we were the great equalizer in the Great War. So people viewed America, particularly in the 40s and 50s, as the greatest nation in the world. Hands down, nobody can stand up to us.
Man, you know what? I think it's really interesting you bring up World War II. People always talk about it in various angles and they try to highlight specific things about it. But I think the biggest thing is all the legislation that FDR passed and how America changed afterwards, the ways that we impacted the world and adopted culturally. There's a lot of things that are very important. I almost feel like that should be the thing we talk about in a future segment. The real impact of World War II. There's the propaganda impact of World War II that's always talked about and is used way too much to the point where I think it doesn't really have meaning. And people know what those are.
Yeah.
But there's other things that are very significant that happened in World War II that have shaped and changed the world. And we are at the heart of a lot of that. But it's not in the ways I think people really understand or come to the forefront of their mind. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't want to touch on it because I feel like that's a lot to discuss. And I feel like we'll do that later.